Welcome to my 206th video on my work with OO gauge. This part will deal with my attempts to get an LMS Jubilee class locomotive running on my Hornby Dublo 3-rail tabletop railway. I pursue projects like this because what I principally like to model is LMS operations in the 1930s, which was when my grandfather's career as a driver with the LMS concluded in retirement. Recently, I've been enjoying working with Hornby Dublo 3-rail, despite quite a few struggles and some failures. But Hornby didn't really produce a lot in Dublo 3-rails suitable for my pre-war LMS prototype. In fact, only one Hornby Dublo locomotive was made truly fitting that prototype, the Duchess of Atholl Coronation class engine, announced in 1938 but only finally becoming available after production resumed in 1947. The only other Dublo 3-rail loco sold in LMS livery was the N2, which is a lovely little model, but not actually modelled on anything that the LMS really ran. One other LMS loco was produced in Dublo 3-rail, the Stania 8F, introduced to Dublo in 1958, but this was only ever sold in BR black livery, so the model needs to be rebadged and renumbered to run as an LMS engine. Beyond the unstreamlined Coronation class based on the Duchess of Atholl model, the 8F suitably rebadged and the N2, inasmuch as that compasses an LMS engine, I'm pushed into improvising if I want additional types of LMS locomotive for my 3-rail railway. Quite early in my 3-rail adventures I was lucky enough to pick up a Wren Royal Scot model which someone had converted for 3-rail running. I've since made a number of efforts to add additional LMS engines, converting a later model Hornby Dublo Black 5 and an Airfix 4F, and refinishing a Dublo 060 diesel-electric shunter to pass as an early LMS engine of similar type. I also tried to get a Trix model of a BR Standard Class 5 running on my Dublo 3-rail track, though I had a lot of problems with that one. When I got one thing working, something else kept breaking. The thinking there was that it could almost pass as an LMS Black 5. Anyway, my latest thought was that I should be able to get a Jubilee class loco running on Dublo 3-rail using a somewhat similar technique to what I used on the Hornby Black 5, modifying a 2-rail loco to run in combination with a tender from the Dublo 8F model, since that tender provides pickup from the centre rail. The 8F tender, representing a standard type of LMS tender from the 1930s, should be okay to combine with a Jubilee. Although since the Jubilees ran in crimson livery as passenger engines in the 1930s, I would need to repaint the 8F tender. But first things first, I had to arrive at a way of adapting a Jubilee model to run 3-rail and combine with an 8F tender. My first thought was to see if I could work with this mainline model of a Jubilee class loco, St. Vincent, which I picked up recently, named for the Caribbean island, consistent with the naming of other Jubilees such as Bahamas, not for the saint himself. But when I first tried this model after taking delivery of it, it had some fairly obvious problems. So this is a mainline Jubilee class, specifically St. Vincent, and I sort of was thinking that I might try to do with this what I did with the Black 5, that is pair it with an 8F tender and try and convert it to 3-rail, but it's clearly going to need servicing first because as we can see, it barely runs. I don't even know whether I should get it round. Okay, well, it may just be very dry, you know. But I mean, these mainline engines are known to be iffy in many ways. So we'll get it onto the bench and see what we can do with it. And if we can get it to running decently 2-rail, then I may try and do a 3-rail conversion on it. So clearly this model was going to require some servicing before any consideration of possible conversion to 3-rail. I got the model into the servicing cradle on the bench. There were 2 body retention screws, one at the back, as seen here. The back of the body shell's also cracked, as you can see. And here's the other body retention screw under the front bogie. I removed the body retention screws. The 2 screws were different, so they needed to be kept distinct. Those are the front wheels from the bogie, which I removed to make access to the front body screw easier. With those screws removed, the chassis could be removed from the body. Like almost all mainline models, this one employed a split chassis. I removed the screws holding on the base plate. Those were short, self-tapping screws, similar to but not the same as the front body screw. I lifted away the base plate, allowing access to the axles. I inspected the axles. The plastic pieces joining the 2 halves of the axles are often a problem with these split chassis models. I applied some grease to the main gear. The drive gears on these mainline models are not very good, thin plastic affairs that often become worn or damaged, causing major problems. However, the axles and the gears looked fairly okay on this model. I completed the lubrication of the main gear with some gear oil. I think the screeching noises were likely caused by the gears being dry. I noticed this nasty-looking blob on one of the driving wheels. When I tried to remove the blob, I realized that the wheel itself was damaged, with part of the flange broken off, and the blob was the result of someone trying to repair the wheel with epoxy or something similar. On the mainline version of the Jubilee, the motor is built right into the chassis. Here you can see the retainers for the brushes, which are mounted on a plastic motor faceplate. The red stuff is Loctite, applied to ensure the screws don't come undone accidentally. I undid the screws and removed the retainers and brush springs. Then I removed the brushes themselves, which are very stubby, as they have to be, as they really need to fit pretty much into the thickness of the motor faceplate. The faceplate is only held on by the brush retainer screws, so once those have been removed, the motor faceplate can be removed, as seen here. Next, I removed the armature. There are little white plastic washers on the front and back of the armature, and you need to be careful to save those and fit them back in place. I'm not sure if this is always the case, but this model had 2 plastic washers on the gear end of the armature and 1 on the other end. The armature itself didn't really look to be in very good shape, but there wasn't very much that I could do about that other than trying to gently clean it up a bit. I cleaned the commutator surface with electrical contact cleaner on a cotton bud. I applied grease and gear oil to the upper gear where it engaged with the armature pinion. Then I refitted the armature and the motor faceplate. Refitting the brushes needs to be done with care, as it would obviously be very easy to lose the tiny brushes or their little springs, or at least it would for me. I put a brush and a spring into the hole in the faceplate. Then I pressed down the spring with my thumb, slid the retainer over it, and screwed the retainer back in place. I tested the motor with my bench power supply and was pleased that it now seemed to run smoothly without horrible noises. I refitted the chassis into the body. There wasn't much I could do about the damaged driving wheel unless I could somehow manage to source a replacement wheel. I got the model back onto my main Hornby layout for some testing. Well, I'm afraid this mainline Jubilee is a bit of a lost cause, really. I mean, it doesn't make that horrible screeching noise now I've serviced it, but I mean, it's got a completely broken wheel, let's face it, so, I mean, there's a limit to what can be done about that. I mean, that wheel's just got a big chunk broken out of it, and that's always going to cause some problems. It goes round now, and it doesn't make the horrible screeching noise, but I don't think it's a candidate for a lot of attention. unless that wheel can be replaced, which is not going to be something easy to do. It goes. I mean, even with a broken wheel, it does sort of go. You can hear it making some sort of bumpy sounds from time to time, but it sort of goes. And it doesn't make a whole switching until that was because it was dry. But not really one of life's successes. You know, it's that wheel's just broken, and I mean, what are you going to do? You know, you know, I mean, I don't know if it's Mazak rock or someone just dropped it or what, but there's a chunk out the edge of that wheel that someone had crudely attempted to repair with epoxy or something. It's a bit. So I mean, it sort of runs now, but I'm loath to really spend a lot more time on it unless I can get spare wheels. Given how iffy the mainline Jubilee was looking, I turned my thoughts to what other Jubilee models I had. I had a couple of others, both by Bachmann, a Galatea, which was still a split chassis model, but with Bachmann's improvements to the mechanism, and an Australia, which, so far as I'm aware, is the only non-split chassis version of a Jubilee ever sold in 00 gauge in LMS livery. The Bachmann split chassis versions use a can motor which is embedded between the two halves of the split chassis, with the brush contacts made inside the chassis halves. As such, it would be a real pain to convert to 3-rail, as the motion and chassis would need to be completely taken apart in order to change the contacts to the motor brushes. It could be done, but you'd have to take the whole wheels, motion, everything off and take the chassis apart. A real pain. The Australia model, on the other hand, was based on a newer design with no split chassis. This is the part number for the Australia at the end of the box. The Australia was also DCC ready with an 8-pin DCC socket in the engine, so it would actually be quite easy to convert to 3-rail, since this could be done simply by rewiring the DCC fitting board, as I did with the Hornby Black 5. But at this point I vacillated. The Bachmann Australia was a very nice model in itself. It came with a Fowler-type tender and looked very handsome on my main Hornby layout. I didn't really feel good about the idea of butchering it to get it to run 3-rail. I thought that it was better left as it was to be enjoyed in its entirety on my 2-rail layouts. So that kind of sent me back to the mainline St. Vincent as the only other option. At least there wasn't very much to be lost there, as it wasn't a great model to begin with. I had a think about how this model might be converted for 3-rail running. The left brush retainer picked up its electrical contact from the left half of the chassis via a long retaining screw that passed through an enlarged hole in the right side of the chassis and screwed into a fitting in the left side of the chassis. To convert the model to 3-rail, I was going to need to isolate this brush so that it was not in contact with either side of the chassis at all. Then I would be able to run a wire from it and plug that into a Dublo 8F tender to get power from the centre rail. Here you can see the left brush with its spring and retainer removed, together with a longer screw that attached it and made contact with the left side of the chassis. It's a bit complicated. As you can see here, the brush retainer screw wasn't actually long enough to reach the left side of the split chassis as such, but it screwed into a brass piece that came through from the left side of the chassis, and another shorter screw was screwed into that piece from the left side of the chassis. What I wanted to do was to line the hole in the right side of the chassis with an insulator so I could attach the retainer using a smaller, shorter screw without making any electrical contact. My first thought was to use the insulation from this red wire that I had, but as you can see it was too big to fit into the hole. I tried the orange wire, but that was too small. I needed something that would fit tightly into the hole so I could screw into it and hold the brush retainer firmly. I found what I wanted with another type of wire which had soft red insulation. With the wire itself removed from a length of the insulation, I could just manage to fit the insulation into the hole in the right half of the chassis. I passed my length of insulation through the motor faceplate. Then I fitted the faceplate to the chassis, pushing the insulation right down into the hole in the chassis. I cut the insulation off flush with the faceplate. Then I chose a suitable screw to attach the brush retainer. I wanted something that would screw firmly into the insulation in the hole and be short enough to not contact the fitting from the left side of the chassis, which was about 6 millimeters in. I had a variety of screws on hand. I believe what I used was a 1.4 millimeter by 5 millimeter screw. With the brush retainer attached with my screw into the insulator, I tested continuity with a multimeter. It was essential that there be no electrical continuity between that brush retainer and either left or right side of the chassis, which there wasn't, so far this approach seemed to be working. I refitted the other brush with its spring and retainer. I didn't change anything for this one, so it was still in contact with the right side of the chassis, and so getting power picked up from the right-hand wheels. I tried powering the motor by applying power directly to the brush retainers. It worked okay. Next, I was going to need a wire running from the left brush retainer to go back to get center rail power from the tender. I powered up my soldering station and tried to solder a thin black wire to the brush retainer. But I couldn't persuade solder to take on the brush retainer. So instead I just loosened the screw a bit, slipped a flattened tinned end of the wire under the retainer and then tightened the screw back up again. Now I tried powering the motor via my newly attached wire, with the other side going directly to the right-hand brush. This worked, so my wire seemed to have okay continuity to the left-hand brush without anything shorting out. I was going to need to pass my wire back to plug it into the front of the tender, so I drilled a hole in the cab wall of the loco body to allow for this. I passed my wire through that hole in the cab wall. The right-hand brush was still only getting power from the right-hand half of the chassis, and so from the right-side wheels. I wanted power from the wheels on both sides to go to that brush for 3-rail running, so I wanted to short across the two halves of the split chassis, something that you'd normally never want to do. I figured that the simplest way to do this was simply to run a self-tapping screw of an appropriate size into the gap between the two chassis halves, as seen here. I checked with my multimeter to make sure that this did indeed provide electrical continuity between the two chassis halves. Now I reinserted the chassis into the body. The first time I fitted it, I got that darn sanding tube on the wrong side of the connecting rod. Very easy to do, and the model would barely run, so I was worried for a bit until I realized it was the sanding tube causing the problem. Once I fixed that problem, getting the sanding tube on the inside of the connecting rod as seen here, the model ran okay with power applied to the end of my wire out the back and to any of the wheels, the driving wheels on either side, which was what I wanted for 3-rail running. Now I needed an 8F tender to complete the setup. I stole the 8F tender from this model. The tender comes attached to the loco via a drawbar screwed on at both ends, and the wire from the loco plugs into a socket in the front of the tender to get power from the center rail, which is picked up by 2 plunger pickups in the center of the tender. I undid the screw at the loco end and disconnected the drawbar. Then I unplugged the wire from the socket. You can see here the sort of simple bent plug-in connector that's used. Here the tender is detached. You can see the 2 plunger pickups for the center rail. These seem to work quite well. I wanted to attach this tender to the mainline loco. I tested them together to check how the level of the drawbar might fit. It seemed that the drawbar from the tender could fit under the back of the loco body okay. I put the loco and tender into the servicing cradle and considered how I might attach the drawbar at the loco end. I fished out a number of screws that might help. I wanted to create a pivoting connection for the drawbar. I just drilled a hole into the floor of the loco body, into which I could fit a screw for pivoting the drawbar. Of course, this wasn't a very strong arrangement with a metal screw going into plastic, so it was going to require fairly careful handling of the loco and tender. Now I needed to plug my wire into the tender. I cut a thin strip of brass sheet to make a contact. I bent that piece of brass to fit into the socket in the front of the tender. Then I tinned the brass piece with solder and soldered the end of my wire to it. Now I was able to plug my wire into the tender socket and make the connection. I put in a screw to pivot the loco end of the drawbar. And I got this rather odd-looking combination onto my 3-rail tabletop for testing. Well, almost against all odds, this weird combination does actually run, although it's almost impossible to persuade it to go over that rather dicky point there without derailing. Nobody likes that point, let's face it. It annoys a lot of rolling stock. But this guy's pony truck really struggles to get over it without derailing. Just edging him backwards there a bit on purpose. Okay, so let's run him. See, he does go, surprisingly. I'm going to. Okay, let's try and stop him there a minute. See, the problem is, can I, however slowly I get him to go over that point without his pony truck derailing? I can't even tell, have I? Yes, I guess I have, if I go super slowly. But it definitely tends to, well, also I did bend one of the centre rails down a bit. It seems like the centre rail on the inner side here, the side nearest to me, was actually sticking up rather, and that was partially what was knocking the bogey off. That centre rail was rather high, and I just bent it down a bit. It's about 30%, but whether we can get him, we have to crawl him over that point for sure. I'm sort of thinking eventually I may just have to give in and take that point out and see if I can put another point. I don't know that I've got anything better though. I'll have to look, see what else I've got. It's, what is it? Let's just go around there again. Let me stop him here. The clock's chiming now. You've heard that plenty of times before. It's a right hand. It's a right hand isolating point. Yeah, I'm certainly not oversupplied with those. I've got one, but I've got one I know that I already lifted because it was making things derail all the time. I'm not sure that I've got a right-hand isolating point that I haven't tried. Oh well, we'll see. And of course, if this is going to continue to run as a combination, that tender is going to need to be refinished in crimson. This was the point that caused the derailing problems. So far as I could see, what was happening was that the body of the front bogie of the mainline model was running very low down, and the centre rail of this point, just next to where my finger is here, was sticking up rather and was hitting the body of the bogie and knocking it off the rails. I did press the loose end of that centre rail down a bit to make it less likely to hit things. I also tried changing the wheels on the bogie. This is very easy to do, as the axles are only held in place by just slipping them under the ends of little bendy plastic bars. I fitted these Dublo 3-rail wagon wheels which I had around the bench. They may look a bit strange, but I think they'll run much more reliably, being heavier and a little bit larger, so raising the centre of the bogie body, making it less likely to hit things. Okay, this is just a little experiment vis-a-vis the problems with the bogie, the front bogie derailing. Famous last words. See, I've put Hornby, see if we can go back on it so you can see them. I put Hornby Dublo wheels on the bogie, Hornby Dublo wagon wheels. They don't look the most sensible. I mean, I could perhaps make them look a bit more sensible by putting some black paint on them or something. They don't look the most sensible, but... clock's chiming again. But they do, I think, famous nice words, we'll see, but I think they do help. So far with my experiments, it seemed that they definitely do help with the derailing problem. They make the bogie much less prone to derailing. So swings and roundabouts, they don't look very nice when you can see them. I mean, you can't see them that well when the thing's just going along the straight anyway, because they only get tucked under the front of the smoke box. But when it's going around a corner, you can sort of see those wheels, and they're a bit ugly. Perhaps could be made a bit less ugly, as I say, by painting them black or whatever. But they definitely, I would say, do help with alleviating the derailing problem. So you can see I'm just taking it straight through the points there without any slowing down. I'm just going to change the points and take it round the inner. When you change the points, you do have to make sure you press these levers all the way down. If you don't quite press the lever down and the point isn't quite changed right, you can't complain if the thing derails, because, you know, if you've not got the point properly changed. Sorry about the chiming. I maybe should have waited here, but anyway. Okay, so let's go again. Now I'm deliberately trying to run here. We're running at 45% power here. I'm trying to run here without making any concessions to slowing down for the points. I mean, I'm not running at super express speed, and so you shouldn't over points, but I'm not making any specific concessions to the points. And he's running over them all, I think you can say, fairly without derailing problems. Still haven't started work on the tender. That was the next thing I wanted to do, but I thought I'd do this little experiment with the bogie first. So I don't know whether I'm going to stick with this or not, but it certainly does, you know, it certainly does provide you with an engine, the loco that runs more reliably, having those wheels on the bogie. Now that this combination seemed to be basically running okay, I figured that I'd better proceed to refinish the tender to match it as closely as possible to the loco. I got the combination back into the servicing cradle. I undid the screw holding the drawbar onto the tender. Given that the screw on the loco end was just going into plastic, I really didn't want to undo that one. I unplugged the wire from the tender. It's good that the connection between the loco and the tender is relatively easy to connect and disconnect, as this means that it's reasonably possible to use the same tender with different locos. I really wasn't sure what to use to paint the tender to match it with the loco, so I sorted out pretty much every variety of somewhat dark red paint that I had. I started by using methyl hydrate on cotton buds to remove the BR markings on the tender. I was planning to paint over the whole of the side, but I figured that it would be best to remove the BR markings first, so there would be no question of their showing through. The methyl hydrate did a pretty good job of removing the BR markings. Then I rinsed thoroughly with plain water. That left me with a fairly clear side, with only quite faint indications of where the BR markings used to be. I did the same thing on the other side. I found that methyl hydrate seems to do a pretty good job for this kind of thing. Next, I wanted to sample all of my red paints to see which matched best. I sorted them out first. The two on the left are acrylics, the other four are oil-based paints. I painted samples of each on a scrap piece of black foam board. I figured that this would give a better indication of how the paints would work over the black paint on the tender. I let the samples dry, as the colours can change quite a bit from when they are wet. Then I checked the samples against the loco. The two that were closest were the Humbrol acrylic, second from left, and the Model Master British Crimson enamel, which I'd mixed with some black to match to my Dublo Duchess models on the right-hand end. The Humbrol acrylic was specifically sold as LMS Crimson, so it really should be in the right ballpark, but I've found the recently manufactured Humbrol paints don't cover at all well when brush painted, unlike the old ones in the little metal cans, which I generally really liked. So I figured I'd be better off using my modified British crimson enamel. I wanted to keep the axle boxes and their springs and fittings black. Rather than trying to paint delicately round them, I went with painting over the axle boxes and fittings with Micromask liquid masking medium. Then I painted over the whole side of the tender with the crimson enamel using a fairly large, soft brush. I painted the sides right up to the top and down to the bottom around the axle boxes, not specifically painting the axle boxes, but basically relying on the masking to protect them. I also painted the back of the tender above the buffer beam. And I painted the other side the same way. I got a little paint where I didn't want it, but that could be tidied up with a little mineral spirits on a cotton bud. Here's the paint after drying. It covered pretty well for a single coat brush painted. That's the brush that I used. Here's the other side of the tender and the front. There seems to be some question as to whether the area on the front at the bottom should be painted crimson or left black, but I went with painting it crimson. I found it harder than I expected to remove the masking from the axle boxes. Usually Micromask will peel right off, but here the heavy texturing of the axle box area meant that a lot of picking with a small screwdriver was required to get the masking off. The result wasn't too great. I did some additional scraping after taking these pictures, especially on the top of the axle box springs, which really should be black. Here's the other side after the initial mask removal, but before the final paint cleanup. Here's the tender after painting with the loco. Honestly, the match was better than I expected. Here's the tender after more attempts on my part to clean up the paintwork. And here with the loco. At this point I was reasonably satisfied. The result left something to be desired, but it was honestly better than I expected to achieve. Here's the loco with the repainted 8F tender and its original tender. The original colour was definitely a bit duller and more purple in tone. Next, of course, I needed to put LMS lettering on the repainted tender. St. Vincent was built at Crewe in 1936. As such, pretty much any of the three main types of LMS lettering might have been used on it: gold, yellow or straw. But the original mainline model used yellow shadowed with red, as would have been normal for an engine in crimson livery. The number and power markings on the loco itself were in the same red shadowed yellow. So clearly it would be best for me to use that same style to mark the new tender. I did have HMRS press fix transfers for LMS yellow loco markings. Somewhat annoyingly, these decals were printed with the LMS logo roundels between the letters of the large red shaded lettering, making cutting out the lettering more difficult. I cut through the carrying tissue for two sets of the lettering, just sort of going round the logos in a curve. Here you can see one set of the letters placed on the new tender, original tender above. When you peel a long decal like this from the press fix backing, it immediately curls right up, so it's a bit fiddly to straighten it out and press it into place on the model. But you don't need to rush, so if you're careful you should be able to get it right. Unfortunately, with the M centred, the L and S on this side of the tender both ended up going over a line of rivets. I wetted the backing tissue with water, peeled it off and discarded it, and then pressed the letters firmly down into place with the flattened end of a cotton bud. Here's the other side of the tender done the same way. In this case, the letters avoided the rivets rather better. I figured that I'd better put a coat of fixative over the decals, so I masked the lower area so that the fixative wouldn't get onto the wheels. Here's the tender back from being sprayed with a coat of matte acrylic fixative. I was a bit disappointed to find that the fixative, supposedly matte, seemed to make the tender look more shiny, to my eye at least, and the colour also appeared darker to me after spraying with a fixative, making the match with the loco less good. I coupled the tender back up to the loco, first plugging in the wire, then reattaching the drawbar with its screw. And here's the finished combination on the 3-rail track. As I say, I was a bit disappointed that the match between tender and loco now looked worse than it first did after the painting. Still, it's not too horrible. Now, a little running video to finish. So, here's the more or less finished Jubilee conversion on the layout. So let's give it some power. It's about 40%. I'm a bit disappointed that I thought the match of the tender was looking quite nice, but putting a final coat of matte fixer. Whoops. Sorry. Did not mean to go into there. That's set in there because I moved the diesel there into the goods branch. That's why that point is set to turn. But I don't want to turn this guy. Not got much clearance there between the siding, but we keep trying. Let me see if I can just, no, I didn't finish my thought there, did I? Well, maybe I did. See, I thought the painting of the tender had made it match really quite well to the loco, but now it doesn't match so well, because when I put the matte fixative on, the matte fixative seems to have made the colour look, although it's supposed to be matte, it's made the colour, to me, look shinier and darker. So it now doesn't match the engine quite so well, but what can you do? I don't think I want to spray the engine. What I will do, perhaps, is just before all the clocks go berserk chiming noon, see if I can quickly get a couple of coaches behind this. Well, I'm rushing a wee bit here, so no guarantees on this. We may get derailments, or he's struggling to pull those, isn't he? He's struggling to pull those. I did not try this before I turned the camera on. Yeah, he's struggling to pull those coaches around the corner. Maybe oiling the bearings of the coaches would help, oiling the axles of the coaches. Yeah, I mean, he's just about managing, but he's really, he's getting a lot of wheel slip trying to pull those coaches. So, and he doesn't have any traction tires or anything, and he's not all that heavy. So, you know, if we want him to pull coaches, we might have to give him a bit more help. Yeah, especially going around that corner, he's really struggling to get those coaches round. Let's not overstrain him. For some reason he doesn't seem to struggle so much around this corner. I don't know why that would be. But, so yes, I imagine he could do with, through there again, but he could do with, we could do with doing a little servicing work on the coaches, I guess. But still, there we do. We do, in a way, at least now have a Jubilee for 3-rail. So I did a little bit more experimentation on this. I thought that the wheel slip might be partially caused by putting the Dublo wheels on the bogie. You know, I thought maybe with them being a little bit bigger, they might be reducing the amount of pressure on the driving wheels and contributing to the wheel slip. So I tried putting the original wheels back in the bogie, but that basically disproved that theory because it didn't improve the wheel slip at all, putting the original wheels back in the bogie. And with the original wheels back in the bogie, it certainly was much more prone to derailing. So I've gone back to putting the Dublo wheels in the bogie, because he just runs much more reliably without derailing with them, and it doesn't seem to make any difference to the wheel slip. What I did do is oiled the axle bearings in the coaches, but there's a limit even to what that'll achieve. They're very poor bearings in these old Dublo coaches. They just have sort of blunt ends on the axles that go right through a hole in a piece of sheet metal that fits into the axle box, so it's just like a sort of axle turning inside a hole in a piece of sheet metal. It's not like a pinpoint axle bearing. It's not a great bearing. So these coaches do impose quite, even with the bearings oiled. And here go the clocks again. Oh dear. Anyway, let's run him despite the clocks. But he's still going to get wheel slip. You see, things haven't really improved particularly. He's still getting the wheel slip because I can't really do much about it. You know, I guess he's just not a very... Well, I could put weight in the loco, possibly. That's about the only thing I could do that would really help, I think, because you know, he just can't really pull these coaches with round bends without wheel slip. He's wheel slipping merrily there. He's getting around, but he's wheel slipping merrily. Somewhat less so for some reason at that end, but yeah, so he's really wheel slipping there. But there's not much I can do about it, as I've oiled the coaches. They're not going to go any more freely than that, so that's about it, you know, other than, as I say, possibly try to take the loco up at the park again and see if there's room to fit some weight inside it to improve the pressure on the wheels. Well, I imagine also if I could find a replacement wheel to replace that broken wheel, that might help, because that can't be helping with things.